Tiny homes, ADUs, modular homes, manufactured homes, mobile homes, RVs, motorized homes, all these terms get used. Some of them are very specifically defined legally, others have very vague definitions. This excerpt from a webinar I got to be a panelist on is going to dive into an incredible amount of detail with two experts from the HCD. You've got Greg Nickless, who's been doing ADU rules longer than anybody. We're really sad to see that he's retiring. It was an honor to be on one of the last panels that he participated in before that big day. John Westfall is going to come at things from more of a codes and standards perspective, kind of a building compliance perspective. And we're going to talk about all the nitty gritty details that get involved in these terms like modular, manufactured, tiny home on wheels, and how they relate to California's ADU rules. This is a good one, so I hope you enjoy.
I want to dive in a little bit on tiny homes. This is something that I see a lot in conversation, and I've been trying my very best to communicate to people that are interested in them that some of these tiny homes are being built to the RV or recreational vehicle codes. And as I understand it, this recreational vehicles are only intended for occasional occupation. It is not permanent occupation or habitation. So I always try to kind of let people know that there's a completely different set of codes that some of these tiny homes are being built to. Do you foresee any issues if a homeowner were to buy an RV, park it, and then rent it out permanently, continuously?
Well, John from Codes and Standards will probably also want to comment on this, but let me give you the ADU side of it. It is another variety of housing type. HCD from housing policy in regards to ADUs is not going to say anything about that occurring. It, as I said earlier, it is up to the local agency to allow that. Some do, some asked to make sure that they can, others will not. Now, getting into ADUs and JADUs, as I mentioned, JADUs must be created within the walls of the primary dwelling. Done. Okay, we talked. Now, ADUs are either manufactured homes or they must comply with local building codes, which means that they've gone in through plan check and they have foundation and they have all the necessary things for egress and lighting and heating and all those other things, foundation, etc. So manufactured home, or they've gone through the local building agency and because they're to comply with local building codes. A tiny home, who knows how and where that was built on a chassis, someone's backyard, and then they want to transport it someplace and park it. That is not a manufactured home, and it is not done per building codes.
Sometimes I'll see people put in Title 25 manufactured housing on what doesn't seem like a very permanent foundation. They go through the process of getting a building permit and getting permanent sewer, water, electrical, but maybe it's crushed gravel and, you know, up on blocks almost. Is that something that the local jurisdiction can have rules about, and like how permanent the foundation needs to be for it to be an ADU? Or can any homeowner go and do that right now within the other regulations of ADUs?
Any homeowner can do that right now. And homeowner by statute will tell the building department the type of permanency for the foundation. Now, for a manufactured home, when we say permanent foundation, it doesn't mean it's going to be there in perpetuity forever, okay? Permanent foundations, when we're talking manufactured homes, and this is Code of Federal Regulations, as well as our local state law or state regulations, indicate the permanent foundation only means it's built to a standard, and that standard is recognized by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the lending institution that will be typically giving a mortgage for that. They want to see a permanent foundation. They want to see it paying taxes, real property taxes, and that permanent foundation, quote unquote, standard is what the minimum accepted to meet those loan requirements. That's the short answer.
And to continue on what John said, Ryan, is that what you're talking about, what you've seen is it's called an above ground set. And so it has the piers and paths underneath it. It has these tie downs that kind of keep it so it's going to do well in an earthquake. The and John said pay taxes. What the instrument or the document is that helps that is the 433A, which basically records that manufactured home, which to the land that it is going to be resting on. So it kind of removes the serial numbers from HCD's records. And it now becomes one with the property. It's part of it. That's the 433A document.
And locally assessed by your county assessor. Yeah. Real property.
It's recorded with just like John said, the county or the tax assessment office jurisdiction that is there. It doesn't look hardly, it's not any different than a manufactured home set up in a manufactured home community. And I want to kind of jump on this one really quick too, because there are certain exceptions with the Title 25 manufactured homes with an ADU. One of them is that they're not required to have solar. So a Title 25 manufactured home is not required to have solar panels. So they're kind of
shocked. Is that shocking
to some people
in California?
No.
So you know, I say this, I've told Greg this over and over again, that you know, manufactured homes are built to federal standards. So they'll work in California, they'll work in Alabama, they'll work in Minnesota. Unlike California standards in Title 24, where we like to put a lot of energy goals and electric vehicle charging stations and photovoltaic power generation, manufactured homes are really, affordability maintenance is the most important thing, not a lot of bells and whistles, meeting, you know, current technology and those things. Now, they're probably years behind, but what we're left with, a manufactured home, is probably the best means for housing affordability for most of America. So
affordability and ADUs, what? So
Greg is the subject matter expert on accessory dwellings. My area is building standards, so I can speak to the tiny homes more further. But just to reiterate what Greg said, manufactured homes are identified in the legislation, in the law, that they are allowable as an ADU. There's as much confusion just as you're sharing on the tiny homes. We did put out an information bulletin. I'll send it to you here as soon as I stop talking, and you can, or I'll try and post it here for the group. But it was issued in 2016. So the confusion went that far back. Oh, you have it. Okay. So the intent of that issuance was, hey, there's a lot of confusion about what is a tiny home. So here are some options. They could be a camping cabin. It could be an RV. It could be a PMRV, a park model RV. It could be built to now with Appendix Q in the California Residential Code. It could be a Title 24 building standard built to the residential code. That's allowable as a tiny home. But mainly, I think primarily the industry, the associations think of tiny homes as the RV by California definition. A recreational vehicle, like you say, is not a permanent dwelling. It is intended for seasonal, the emergency and other use. Okay, so you drive it going camping, okay, and you bring it home and you put it, you know, you have to put your blue tarp over it, right, in your driveway. Yeah. So so that's the intent. Now, with the advent also on building standards with Appendix X and O, which some of your folks may be familiar with, that has to do with emergency housing, where a city or county declares a local sheltering crisis, subsequently may adopt standards to accommodate the limited shelters that are available, to reduce the standards to allow more shelters available for more displaced people. That's the answer some communities are attempting to, or have attempted to implement to address the local sheltering crisis. Now, the RVs as an ADU, as a result of the emergency housing, I think, and the accessory dwelling unit accommodations, locally they may implement an RV or a park model RV as an accessory dwelling unit locally. We don't recognize that at the state level because, just like you say, it's not a permanent dwelling. But any city or county, 540 of them, can make their own local emergency housing accommodation, impose that or add that to their ADU inventory, if you will. And that's a local city or county question that needs to be asked directly.
John, one of the things that I'm kind of curious about, because I know with Title 25 manufactured homes, and even with a factory built Title 24 compliant, something built, they all have some level of insignia that is required to be placed on those structures. I would be curious to know if you have have an opinion on the RVs, because there are so many people and there's so much money coming into the ADU space where companies are offering ADUs or tiny homes, and they are not sharing or disclosing to what codes they're being built to. And I find that is a really serious problem, because some of the companies are putting modular, here's our modular tiny home. So if you're in the industry, and like I have been for 20 years, modular kind of also denotes factory built. But factory built is this thing that the general person, the average person just doesn't understand the way that the codes are termed. And so would be interested if you had an opinion that there should be some state level regulation that whatever you're going to be used for, however you're going to be selling a tiny home or something similar that's going to be occupied, you should be required to to identify what it is in your advertisement or websites.
Well, my opinion, of course, that truth in lending, truth in purchase, and all that, but the due diligence and the of the person who's purchasing is very important, that they understand the nuances here, and hopefully they're all listening out there, because now they can make a more educated purchase. Recreational vehicles are not regulated by Department of Housing. Park model recreational vehicles are not either. Although I think we've had managers that had wanted to go there, but because park models look like a little tiny home, right? But tiny homes, ultimately, back to when I think of someone saying that, I default to the fact they're thinking it's on a chassis with an axle and tires, okay, and a license plate. All right, so that's an RV, and much of my day is carving out and investigating the question that people have on whatever structure or vehicle they're trying to inquire with me about. You're right, modular, prefab, pre-engineered, pre-whatever do not mean anything, and much of the interview to find out what the building standards are, so I can share what the rules are for that building, is taken to make sure we're speaking by the same definitions. I would say that, and I can't speak that the local authorities are going to be necessarily very helpful to be right there. They should understand, though, that a factory built housing and I call that a modular. That's kind of modular is the national term. In our state, California is factory built housing. Those are modular products, typically volumetric boxes or panels. All of that work and all of our Title 25 structures are built closed constructed. And that's where you get an insignia in the case of our Title 25 California buildings, or a HUD label in the case of a manufactured home. So those labels, those insignias, give a level of standards that are approved for permanent dwellings. RVs, you may have, because the industry oversees the building standards for that, whether or not they adhere to any standards, but typically A1 19.5, or I'm sorry, ANSI A1 19.5 for a park model, and the NFPA 1192 for an RV specifically. Those will guide the your tiny homes on wheels that we probably speak so much to. Does that help?
It does get very confusing because there's so much hype out there. I still think the ADU industry is the wild west. Yeah, and I think there are a lot.
It comes down to ask about.
Greg's the sheriff of the wild west.
Yeah. Ask about the building permit, because you'll have a building permit. You'll have a building permit for an ADU. If a manufactured home is going to serve as an ADU, John, you'll still have a building permit because it's need to go through the planning department at least, and maybe the building department for the foundation and the utilities, right?
Yeah, the building permit will be specifically for the installation of.
So comes down to, David, is there a building permit? If there's not a building permit, beware.
Okay, now, but again, back to the locals with an emergency housing twist, and are allowing the our tiny home on wheels as a means of ADU and emergency housing kind of accommodation. So there are, I don't know they would necessarily issue a building permit for
Probably not
an RV that's an ADU. I really don't know how that works.
See,
honestly,
it wouldn't be,
but I do know some ordinances and cities and counties have codified that.
so no building permit, beware.
Well,
You'll
I think
have a
that
building
also my
permit.
thing is beware, because if they say you can just plug it in, let's just plug it in. I'm like, red flags. That means that you
Oh yeah, yes.
connect
yes.
the hose, connect the
orange
electrical,
extension cord.
the extension cord, and you have an ADU that you're going to rent out where I live, city of Burbank, for $2,000
Yeah.
a month rent.
Sewer, water, electricity. You got them underground, or well,
Yeah.
two of them are underground.
Yes, one of the codes, let me ask you this, and I'm sorry, Ryan, I kind of categorize them as Title 25, Title 24, and RVs. And so those are kind of like the three big boxes or channels that I'm trying to say, okay, ask the question. Yeah, Greg, you were saying, does it have a building permit? And if it doesn't have one, beware. I've always kind of said, if it's not built to Title 25 or Title 24, beware.
Well, people will say, what's a Title 24 and what's a Title 25?
Well,
know
and then-
people
then you
know
would
people
say-
know what a building permit is.
Then you would say, look for the label if it's an RV, look for the insignia if it's factory built housing, and then look for the HUD label if it is a manufactured home. And those are, and actually the Title 25 really identify the types of industrialized buildings that can be built off-site.
Right.
And each of those, because they're built off-site, they're closed constructed and need to be inspected in the factory. That's where our HCD third-party inspectors go visit those factories to make sure that they're inspected, just as any building inspector would inspect an on-site constructed home. So it's either has the Title 25 insignia or label. Now,
Right.
factory-built housing is a Title 25 structure, but the building standards point to Title 24 as the building standards for that type of structure, which is just the same as you would design approve any local constructed building. So
Right.
it's Title 24. And then I think you're right. The RV is totally separate because we don't regulate that. Title 25 says, hey, we don't do this anymore. The industry took it back.
How was there? Okay.
You just got to wait now a year or two to get it built, though, because there's a long
Don't get me
line.
started on that, John. I mean, I got a quote to do a project in 24 months, and I'm like, what? Yeah, manufacturer. So somebody put into the and yes, for a layperson, this group kind of banding about terms that we all understand really well is hard to kind of digest. Manufactured homes are built to a state code regulated by Housing and Community Development, HCD. Above HCD is the Housing Housing and Urban Development, HUD. So that's the federal level. HCDs are state level, and they regulate anything that is going to be built in a factory. And you've heard John say closed, I think closed construction, meaning that you have your walls, they have the electrical or the plumbing is already in those walls, the insulation is in those walls, and the drywall is put on there. So it is closed up before it is taken to your home or your site, so that the local jurisdiction is not going to be able to inspect it. So they have to have inspectors, third-party people that go in to make sure that everything has been built according to the state's requirements for that home. The Title 24 is actually the energy component of the state's code, the California building codes. And that's kind of how you kind of say, that's going to be the state's local jurisdiction, with local jurisdictions, that's Title 24. Am I right with that?
Kind of. So the Code of Federal Regulations set the HUD standards. HCD does not get involved in that. HUD has their own third-party agencies. They're called the DAPIA, they're called the IPIA, who does design review and in-plant inspections in Arizona, in Oregon, in whatever state that the building's manufactured in, regardless of where it's sent to. So that's that. In California, we have our own factories that build HUD products, but Arizona and Oregon feed the north and south areas quite regularly with those type of buildings. The Title 24 California Building Standards Code includes building standards, framing, energy, structural, electrical, plumbing, mechanical, instead of the HUD code or the manufactured home construction safety standards is what they call the Code of Federal Regulations. So it's a different recipe book for factory built housing that we set here locally in the state. The recipe book for manufactured homes is set by HUD. And so that's kind of the way to look. I kind of look at it, a recipe for HUD and a recipe for HCD.
You can watch the full webinar here, or you can binge watch a bunch of excerpts at this playlist. Greg Nickless has been working on ADUs for years. I'm very sad to see that he's retiring imminently, and I hope that he stays in the ADU space after his tenure at the HCD.